The second half of the 1980s is hardly remembered as a golden era for American cars, at least when it comes to power and straight-line acceleration. And a V6 is certainly not what usually comes to mind when people hear the term muscle car. Yet in 1987, General Motors released a car without a V8 that many enthusiasts still consider the last true muscle car of that era. The car in question is the Buick Grand National, or more precisely, its most extreme version, the Buick GNX. In the mid-1970s, Buick had a reputation for building cars for retirees. People even joked about it. Buicks are driven either by grandparents or by teenagers who borrowed one for the evening. Which makes it all the more surprising that the organizers of the Indy 500 approached Buick with a proposal. Would they be willing to provide one of their cars as the pace car? Buick agreed. Inside the company, there was hope that participating in such an event might help shake off that less than exciting image. But there was one problem. By the mid-1970s, even massive 455 cubic inch V8s had been choked down to roughly 200 horsepower because of new emissions regulations. And if a car was going to lead the field at one of the most iconic oval races in America, setting the pace for the fastest open-wheel machines in the country, it really had to match the level of the event. So in the first year, they didn't try anything too complicated. They took a 455 cubic inch engine, gave it a bit of tuning, and installed it into the mid-size Buick Century sedan. But after that, the real experiments began. In 1976, Buick decided to use the Indianapolis 500 pace car as a showcase for a new technology, a turbocharged V6. For the American auto industry at the time, that was a rather unconventional move. By the early 1970s, Buick had already been experimenting with turbocharging its 231 cubic inch V6. The goal was simple: combine fuel efficiency with acceptable performance. No one was chasing horsepower. The industry was trying to adapt to emissions regulations and the aftermath of the fuel crisis. But testing was far from smooth. The engine was unstable with backfires and intake issues. At the same time, in peak conditions, running over 20 pounds per square inch of boost, it could produce more than 300 horsepower, an impressive figure for a compact V6. That was the kind of engine they put into the pace car. One of the first times an Indy 500 pace car was powered not by a naturally aspirated V8, but by a turbocharged engine of smaller displacement. Then came the real challenge. Engineers had to figure out how this technology would behave outside the lab, in daily driving with heat, fuel quality, and warranty concerns. Production cars arrived in 1978. Boost was reduced to about 6 pounds per square inch, and output dropped to around 165 horsepower. Far from the experimental numbers, but finally suitable for mass production. By today's standards, that doesn't sound like much. But in the late 1970s, almost no one fully understood how turbocharged engines would behave in real-world conditions. The turbocharged V6 first appeared in the Regal and LeSabre. At the time, only a few companies were experimenting with turbocharging: Porsche, Saab, and BMW. Today it's rarely mentioned, but General Motors was among the first to seriously push turbocharging into the mass market. By 1979, the engine was also available in the Century and Riviera, and Chevrolet soon followed. But by the early 1980s, it became clear the technology still needed work. In 1983, the first generation of Buick turbo engines was discontinued. The turning point for the 231 cubic inch V6 came in 1984. The carburetor was replaced with electronic fuel injection, adding roughly 20 horsepower. A more advanced ignition system followed, allowing for more precise control of combustion and reducing the risk of detonation. As a result, boost pressure was increased to around 10 to 12 pounds per square inch, and the Buick Regal became a much more appealing option for those who wanted real power under their right foot without sacrificing comfort. The Grand National had technically appeared earlier, in 1982, but it went largely unnoticed. Only 215 cars were built, and just a small portion of them were equipped with a turbocharged engine. The rest came with a naturally aspirated unit, producing about 125 horsepower, which didn't quite live up to the Grand National name inspired by Buick's NASCAR success. Everything changed 2 years later. The car received a turbocharged V6 with electronic fuel injection and a Garrett turbocharger, while the color palette effectively narrowed down to a single option: black. After that, people started paying attention. Despite its aggressive appearance, the Regal Grand National was still a fairly boxy coupe, far from what most would consider sleek or fast-looking. But in terms of performance, it could now go head-to-head with the Ford Mustang and Chevrolet Camaro, and in some cases, even approach Corvette territory. In 1984, around 2,000 cars were built. The following year, 2,102. And even that wasn't enough to meet the growing demand for the Grand National package. In 1986, the 231 cubic inch V6, now designated LC2, received an intercooler and an upgraded intake system. This pushed output to 235 horsepower, and a year later, to 245. At the time, even major automotive publications made it clear that this Buick was no longer playing in its own league. In testing, the car reached 60 miles per hour in just 4.9 seconds, right in line with some of the best performance cars of the era. Based on those results, journalists suggested that the engine's real output might have been significantly higher than advertised, possibly somewhere around 290 horsepower, and that Buick may have deliberately understated the numbers. Meanwhile, market forces were already shaping the future. By 1987, Buick management was preparing to move the model to the new front-wheel drive GM10 platform. But demand for the Grand National had grown so strong that shutting the project down simply wasn't an option. In 1986, Buick built 5,512 cars. In 1987, that number jumped to 20,470. Out of those, just 547 carried the GNX badge. The GNX came to life largely because Buick wanted to put a definitive end to this story. It started as a plan for 200 cars, then 500, and ultimately, due to dealer commitments, settled at 547. The goal was ambitious: build the fastest production car in General Motors history, one that collectors would chase for years and automotive journalists wouldn't forget anytime soon. To achieve that, they chose not to compromise. Cost was no longer a concern, and the word compromise itself was effectively removed from any discussion. This final chapter, built around one turbocharger, 6 cylinders, and rear-wheel drive, had to be loud. Working closely with McLaren, Buick's engineers got to work. The objective wasn't to make the Grand National just a little faster. It was to create a car that outperformed the base version in every aspect, from interior finish to handling. And, as was often the case in the American industry at the time, they didn't start with the brakes. They started by extracting more power from the engine. Through revised electronics, a completely reworked exhaust system, upgraded cylinder heads, and a modified turbocharger with a ceramic rotor, they were able to produce 276 horsepower from the 231 cubic inch V6, running about 14.5 pounds per square inch of boost. The body was reinforced to match the increased performance. The T-top option was removed, and the rear suspension was essentially redesigned from scratch, so that the engine's torque would translate into acceleration, not tire smoke. Even the tires themselves were different from those used on the standard Grand National. The car also received a transmission oil cooler, fiberglass fender flares, 16-inch wheels, and additional gauges inside the cabin. And credit where it's due. Despite the American industry's fondness for decorative vents, the fender louvers on the GNX were fully functional, effectively helping to extract heat from the engine bay. To remind the owner just how special the car was, a numbered plaque was mounted on the passenger side of the dashboard. And finally, a small but very telling detail. Each car came with a black jacket featuring the GNX logo. After all, people had to know who the fastest guy in the neighborhood was, even if he was just sitting at a 10. At the same time, the GNX was never officially listed in Buick's catalog. Before launch, 2 pre-production cars were shown to the press at GM's Proving Ground in Arizona. There, journalists recorded 0 to 60 miles per hour in 4.7 seconds, and a quarter mile in 13.5 seconds at 102 miles per hour for a car weighing 3,474 pounds. In practice, the GNX became the fastest production car built in the US at the time. Only cars like the Ferrari F40 and Porsche 959 could match its performance. Dealers received the cars at $29,290, but markups often pushed prices past $50,000, with some reaching $75,000. Each of the 547 owners paid not just for performance, but for a piece of automotive history. In one thing, the creators of the car were absolutely right. Collector interest did not disappoint. In January 2025, a GNX with just 282 miles sold at a Barrett-Jackson auction for $231,000.